Welcome to the Books and Travel podcast. I'm Jo Frances Penn, thriller and dark fantasy author, bringing you escape and inspiration about unusual and fascinating places, as well as the deeper side of books and travel. You can find the episode show notes at booksandtravel.page, and if you enjoy thrillers set in international locations, download one of my ebooks for free at jfpen.com/free. Hello travellers, I'm Jo Frances Penn, and in today's show I'm talking to Lachlan Page about Colombia in South America. We all pick up ideas about a country from a lifetime of media, and our opinions can be shaped by stereotypes that persist even once a country has changed. Colombia is associated in many people's minds with drugs and cartels and violence from the 1980s and 1990s, amplified by TV shows and films about the time. But while there are always dangers in any country, Colombia is now quite different. Lachlan talks about how he ended up there after prioritising travel first and work second. He gives recommended places to visit, tips for safety, and talks about whether being bilingual changes your personality, cross-cultural marriage, and much more. So I hope you enjoy the interview today. Lachlan Page is the author of Magical Disinformation, a spy novel with a satirical edge set amongst the Colombian peace process. So welcome, Lachlan.
Thanks, Jo, for having me.
Oh, no, it's good to talk to you about this. Now, first off, I wanted to talk about your interesting jobs. You've worked some very interesting things: volcano hiking guide, Red Cross volunteer, and language teacher, among others. So how has travel shaped your career?
Yeah, I put all the most interesting jobs on there. There's a lot of other jobs that perhaps weren't as interesting, but I've really been, interested in travel since I was a teenager and tried to travel every opportunity I could through my university years. I think when I was about 18 or 19, I did a backpacking trip through Europe for 2 months. Later, I studied abroad in France and the UK, and that kind of eventually led me down a trail of doing those kind of different odd jobs. Eventually, when I returned to Australia, I graduated university, did an office job doing market research reports, and from my previous Spanish-speaking skills, I actually got that job because it involved a lot of reading in Spanish and then using that information for the market research reports. And one of my bosses was from Costa Rica, so I think that kind of idea of travel and language definitely shaped that early part of my career. But I guess I kind of soon realized, like a lot of people, that office type of job wasn't for me. And I set off after that and went to Guatemala and continued learning Spanish. And that's where, through the school I was studying at, I got in touch with a volunteering organization, which put me in touch with the Guatemalan Red Cross in a central highland city called Coban, which is kind of it's a little bit off the tourist trail, but there's a very popular river waterfall nearby called Samuk Champay, which a lot of people go to. And so it was in that area. And I was there for about 3 months, 2 to 3 months, doing volunteer work with the Red Cross. And that was kind of based in what I'd studied, which was international business. So helping them set up spreadsheets and very basic Excel type things, but also getting out into the field occasionally for a lot of health checks and a lot of health information, where I was doing more the organizing of the data and things like that, not the actual health aspects. And then from there, really, I kind of continued traveling through Central America and originally had my sights set on Panama. But as I was going through Nicaragua, I did a kind of volcano trek tour. And when it finished, I saw that they're actually hiring for people to become volcano guides. And so I ended up applying and pretty much being accepted on the spot, and did that for 6 months. And then later down the track, I continued in other various jobs before I trained to teach English as a second language. And that's kind of led me to what I do now, which is teaching at a university in Australia, not in English, but in humanities and business subjects, but focused on international students. And so I still, pre-pandemic, did a lot of trips in China and Indonesia for that as well. So I guess all of that kind of, that travel and that idea, it's just led me to various opportunities that you probably wouldn't have if you just stayed in the same place or even in your own country. I think it kind of pushes you outside of your comfort zone and you're exposed to new opportunities. And I think, that's probably, how it's really impacted it.
Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, it sounds like you made travel the priority and then did work and obviously kept yourself alive and paying the bills while you traveled, as in the travel came first and the jobs came second, which I feel like a lot of us, we choose the work first and then we fit travel around it. But I can see how you've kind of created a career around the travel. But I want to just come back on the volunteering. So years ago, I tried to volunteer with something and they basically said, sorry, to be honest, you're not very useful. Like, we really want people who have medical skills or who can build a well or who can help with bridges. And I was like, to be fair, I get that. But so you found that your office skills are useful. I mean, because I think a lot of people want to volunteer, but may also feel like they're not useful enough.
Yeah, I think, because I looked at a lot of volunteer programs and a lot of them are like that, where you need specialist skills and people still do them and they pay a lot of money to do them. But I knew a lot about that from my studies, that wasn't always the best way to go about it. So, and I think possibly this volunteer opportunity, if I had done it from Australia saying, hey, I'm going to come over and do this, they probably wouldn't have said yes, because it's not something that you would go to all of that effort to bring someone across. But because I was there, because they explained a bit about where they needed help and how I could help with my skills, we kind of found that fit of, and it wasn't just me. There was a student there of accounting, and she had a little bit of knowledge in that area, but she was still studying, and I'd just finished studying, so I had a little bit more professional experience than her to be able to help her. And so it was that idea of my skills were needed rather than, I was just kind of jumping in there and doing something because I'm from Australia, for example. So, but it is a tricky aspect to try and find something where you can really add value with your skills.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I think you were right. I mean, you were in a place already and then you looked for opportunities. That sounds like what you do. But let's talk about Colombia. Your first novel is set there. And obviously you've traveled loads of places. So why Colombia? What about it captivated you enough to write a book about it? And tell us about your trips there.
Yeah, well, after all that travel that I just mentioned, and I started to teach English, I had a job lined up in South Korea to teach English. And so I did that for 1 year. And at the end of that experience, I thought, where do I want to go to continue teaching English, to continue working? And because I'd traveled in Colombia at the end of that trip that I mentioned before, I thought, okay, I'll go back to Colombia and I'll start there again and spend 1 year to see how I go. And I ended up staying 4 years, met my now wife there, and we've since returned to Australia. But I ended up teaching English there and also teaching university subjects, and studied further there as well. So I think initially when I went to Colombia, it was very much off the tourist trail. It wasn't on the usual backpacking route of South America. There was quite a lot of travelers in the backpacking scene, but not as much as if you go to Peru or to even Central America or Argentina, Brazil, for example. So it was very much off the beaten track. There was a lot of the places you would go to, there was only maybe like one hostel to stay in. So everyone ended up at that hostel, and people were very friendly, very curious. It just felt that had that new vibe of being untouched. And I think also Colombian people, and everybody says this about Colombia, that when you go there, you're welcomed by everybody and everyone's friendly, everyone's curious, everyone chats to you, and it's a very welcoming culture. And I think South America in general, or Latin America in general, is like that. But I think Colombia in particular has a special kind of welcomeness that it gives to tourists. And also, Colombia has mountains, jungle, desert, beaches, a whole range of the spectrum of all of the kind of landscapes that you find all over the world. So you can do a lot of things in a smallish area, even though Colombia's a big country, but in a small, the one country in that small area, you can do a lot of things that you could experience, for example, all over the continent of Latin America. So I think those two things probably led me to return to actually live there. And with my book, I'd always dabbled with that idea of writing a book, and I love spy novels, I love travel books, and so I like the idea of combining the two. And I think because I'd lived in Colombia for 4 years and traveled back and had family there through my wife, it's probably the country I know the best after Australia. So I thought it was really right for a book. And there's quite a few spy novels and action movies that are set in Colombia, but they tend to focus very much on the same story of drugs, cartels, guerrilla, with very little depth. I felt that it didn't really capture the nuances of Colombia. For example, people who've lived in Colombia, there's a running joke that whenever Colombia is in the movies or books or TVs, it shows it in a very different light to how it actually is. For example, there's the movie Mr. and Mrs. Smith with Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, and they're in Bogota and they show it's hot and tropical with chickens running in the street, whereas in reality it's very cold and rainy and it's quite a developed city, right? It's on similar levels to a European city, for example, in many ways. So I felt like that had to be addressed and the real Colombia had to shine through. And also just there's a lot of, let's say, wacky, crazy stories and little events that have happened in Colombia that you wouldn't believe are true, but they are. And so I included a lot of those in my book, which I think just proves that fiction can be a lot stranger than the truth and vice versa in Colombia. It's hard to sometimes know that line between fiction and truth. And that's kind of a big theme, I think, in the book as well.
Oh, lots to unpack there. So first of all, you mentioned the range of natural landscapes. So tell us some of the highlights of the country in terms of natural beauty and some of the places you recommend visiting.
I think for me, my favorite place in Colombia is what's called the Coffee Triangle, which is a area in West Colombia around the cities of Manizales, Armenia, and Pereira. And it's where most of the Colombian coffee comes from. So there's rolling green hills, coffee fincas, small colonial villages, beautiful scenery, very good coffee if you can find it. It's a lot of Colombians drink Nescafe, although that's changing and people are trying to drink, the actual good coffee from Colombia. So I think the coffee zone in particular is a highlight for me. Definitely something, that's a very unique, I think, Colombian place. Also, in terms of beaches, the stretch of beaches from Santa Marta in the Caribbean coast running north is probably the most popular area for beaches. And there's a national park there called Tayrona National Park, which is a national park along the coast. And you actually need to hike in about 1 hour to get to the beaches. So there's not like big sky rises and there's not a lot of development there. So it's quite a very secluded place, and the beaches are amazing. And as you go further up that coast, you get to the Guajira Peninsula, which is probably not so well traveled as the other places in Colombia, but it's, again, the beaches are very good, and it's like a desert landscape, and you can see flamingos, and there's very good seafood and very interesting aspects with the indigenous culture of the peninsula there. So I'd probably say those are some of the highlights. There's a lot of other places that I could mention, but I think for me, they're probably the main highlights or the things that I find interesting and love to explore in Colombia.
I'm just looking on the map, on Google Maps,
right.
as you're talking. And if people can't picture it in their head, it's on that northwest corner, I guess, of South America. But as you said there, the Caribbean Sea, and I was like, oh yeah, like some of it's on the Caribbean, and then the other half borders the Pacific, right? So those must be very different coasts.
Yeah, well, in fact, so if you kind of zoom in on the map, so you'll see roads leading up on the Caribbean coast, but on the Pacific coast, there's almost no roads going to the coast. You'll see there's the port of Buenaventura, which is on the Pacific coast. There's a city there, and that's one of Colombia's two major ports. But all that other coast, there's actually no roads that go there. So you either need to fly in or you need to go by boat through different river systems. And some of those areas as well, especially towards Ecuador and especially towards Panama, and kind of a lot of that area is quite untouched and has had a lot of conflict and still has a lot of conflict. So there are probably no-go zones where you wouldn't go, or there's a heavy military and guerrilla presence. I haven't traveled there, but a lot of people I know have, and it is very different. It rains a lot more on that coast. There's a lot more tropical, kind of jungly, I guess, right up until up until the coast, on the Pacific coast, that is.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so let's just come back on that, because you've mentioned the drugs and cartels come up, and then you just mentioned military there and a no-go area. So let's address the safety, because it feels like there has been a dangerous reputation in the past, like Medellin, I guess it was back in the 80s really, whereas I think now there's a lot of really interesting stuff there. I mean, every country has its dangers, obviously, but what should people watch out for, and what are the ways to behave in order to make it a safe country to visit?
I think most of those kind of the things to do with military, guerrilla, paramilitaries, those dangerous aspects are in those outer reach areas of Colombia. So you wouldn't normally get there as a traveler. So I don't think that's really kind of something that people would come across. But I think in terms of all of Latin America, in the big cities, there is definitely crime, and sometimes violent crime. It's obviously improved. In terms of the dangerousness of a city, they usually use the per capita murder rate, and Bogota now rates below Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, Baltimore in the US. So Bogota, the capital, is a lot safer in that respect than a lot of US cities, which is an interesting kind of way to look at it, and it really throws people when you tell them that. But there still is a lot of crime, and so I think the usual tips like pickpockets, so having an internal pocket or a pocket with a zip is very advisable, I'd say, while traveling there. You wouldn't have your wallet in your back pocket. Likewise, at a cafe or restaurant, especially if it's outdoors, you'd have your bag with the loop of the bag or the strap looped around your leg, not leaving laptops or phones out on the table, even if they're right in front of you, because there can be groups that distract you very easily, and then they just take it right out from under your nose. So that's something to be very, very wary of. And with, I think, any types of electronic devices that are quite expensive, it's not a good idea to have them out and shown. And Colombians have a saying called dar papaya, which literally means give papaya, or give popo, which is sometimes papaya is known. But that's the literal translation. But what it really means is don't kind of put yourself out there in a position where people can take advantage of you easily, or don't tempt fate. So it's kind of saying don't walk down the street opening your wallet with your iPhone and with flashy jewelry. So I think those types of things are advisable. I think also things like with taxis, you have to sometimes be careful in Bogota. There has been hold-ups in taxis, and certain aspects of you're getting in a taxi late at night and the taxi driver might not be the real taxi driver. So there's things like that as well, where they have apps or a number you can call to order taxis safely. So that's kind of recommended as well.
Yeah, a lot of these things are sensible things to do in any country. And I think when we're thinking about a trip, then it's thinking about those things, and as you say, behaving in an appropriate way. But I wanted to come back on, you mentioned Colonial Villages in that coffee triangle. But how does that complicated history of indigenous people and colonization, how has that affected the places? So tell us about some of the interesting places that reflect the history.
Well, I think, obviously the legacy of the Spanish, I guess we call it invasion or conquest of the Americas, has had a big impact in Colombia. So a lot of the architecture, a lot of the buildings, you'll find beautiful cathedrals, ancient kind of forts on the Caribbean coast that were trying to keep the English and Dutch pirates away from the Spanish gold and silver. A lot of the very small villages are probably the most kind of, because a lot of the cities, I think, in Colombia have, developed, and they've got new modern skyscrapers and office buildings and apartment buildings, whereas a lot of the villages, which in the past were quite important towns in the new Colombia, but have now really been left behind, and so a lot of them can feel stuck in a time warp. So, for example, Villa de Leyva is a small town near Bogota that's very nice. Mompos, which is a town on a river towards the Caribbean coast. It was a very, very important town in Colombia along the Magdalena River, but is now very much, stuck in a time warp. It's often kind of linked to the novels of Garcia Marquez, thinking that Mompos was used as a setting for a lot of his novels. So there's obviously that the architecture, I think, is very much reflected in that Spanish colonial style. However, the indigenous culture, as I mentioned, up near the coast, near Santa Marta, there is a small mountain range called the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. And there you'll find what's known as the Lost City, which is kind of like ancient ruins of the Tairona people and the various other smaller indigenous groups around there who live there. And that was only discovered, and as say discovered in inverted commas, in 72. So it wasn't really something that was touched a lot by the Spanish in many ways, but is something that is kind of a very interesting indigenous site, I guess. And actually in Bogota, the Gold Museum has a lot of gold artifacts from the Muisca people, who were the indigenous group around Bogota in the central highlands of Colombia. So yeah, there is, I think, that mix of that heritage between the Spanish colonial but also indigenous culture that you can explore in Colombia.
Yeah, and I love cathedrals. What's the best cathedral or the beautiful architecture that you would recommend for those of us who love the religious side of things?
Well, to be honest, I don't know a lot of the cathedrals. I think compared to maybe some other Latin American countries, they're maybe a little bit smaller than some of the other ones, or even the ones in Spain. But I know there's the Convento de Santo Domingo in Cartagena. So that's on the Caribbean coast. Cartagena is a beautiful walled city that looks a bit like Cadiz in Spain, if you've been there, or Havana in Cuba. It's kind of a fortified walled city. And yeah, the Convento de Santo Domingo, there is quite an impressive church and convent. In the very, very far south, I actually haven't been there, but there's a very impressive cathedral called Ipiales Cathedral, and I forget the name. It's Santuario something, Las Lajas, I believe it's called. I actually haven't been there, but I've seen photos of it, and it looks amazing. It's kind of in a canyon and almost looks like a German style cathedral.
I also wanted to ask you about speaking different languages, because obviously you're Australian, so to my ear I can hear your Australian accent, but then when you're saying some of those Spanish names, it sounds like your Australian accent disappears. And of course you lived in Colombia a long time, your wife's Colombian, so presumably your Spanish is pretty good these days. How does it change the way you think, or does it change the way you think when you speak in different languages? Do you turn into a different personality? This is something I've heard from other sort of bilingual friends.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, when my wife and we met, we only spoke in Spanish for the first 2 or 3 years. It wasn't until we made a trip to Australia for a holiday and we kind of started speaking in English, and she got a bit of practice. And now, she's fluent in English, but we still speak Spanish at home. So we speak it every day, dipping in English occasionally. So it's something like I actually also I did a master's in linguistics, and so I looked at a lot of these things about, does it change your personality, does it not, when you interact? And I'm not sure if it changes my personality a lot, but what I would say is that when you are speaking in that language, you need to communicate. You're usually communicating with the people who speak that language, so I think you kind of adapt to their communication forms, their patterns, the way they communicate. And so I think it's a bit of a Latin stereotype, but I think it's true. They're quite outgoing, loud, and very talkative. So I guess I probably become a bit more like that when I speak Spanish. I know also in Colombia, in particular in Bogota, they're quite formal in the way they speak, and they're very indirect as well. So instead of saying, it's hot, can you turn on the air conditioner? They might say, oh, it feels hot in here, and don't you feel like it's hot? And that's kind of a clue to you that you need to open a window or turn on the air conditioner. So there's that kind of indirect way. So I guess in that sense, I think it probably does change the way I interact and communicate with people.
That's interesting you say that, because I feel that's very English. Because when I came to Australia, I came to Australia in 2000 and travelled around. Obviously, I lived in Australia for a number of years, and I often felt like I couldn't even communicate with Australians, even speaking the same language, because as a British person, we come at things from an angle. Like you say, we're very indirect, whereas the Australian culture is very direct. So that's interesting you say that. I wonder if that is a European influence, or whether that is that part of the indigenous culture as well.
I think probably part of the indigenous culture, but I think also a European thing. Because I think I've experienced that in Spain a little bit, and it's funny, the English thing, because in Bogota a lot of people wear tweed jackets and scarves and ties, and they dress quite formally and wear brogues, and so there is a lot of people in Bogota I think I kind of really like that English culture and have maybe a similar type of temperament in some ways, in Bogota at least. But yeah, and I think, yeah, you're right, it is different to the way in Australia we're probably a bit more direct and to the point in that sense.
Yes, and I also wanted to ask you about cross-cultural marriage, not just cross-cultural, cross-hemisphere, because I'm also the same, living in the UK. My husband, I met in New Zealand, and so we have to travel back to New Zealand for family reasons. And people are always like, oh, you're having a holiday. It's like, no, it's a family trip. It's like going to see someone else. So I mean, there's pros and cons on cross-cultural marriages, but how do you find that? I mean, is Colombia now somewhere where you travel for family trips, or can it still be a holiday?
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. We usually go back every year or 2 years, pre-pandemic. But whenever we go back, we pretty much have a week in Bogota where it's family and friends and things like that. So it does feel like when we go back, we have to spend probably that week in Bogota catching up. Otherwise, the family might know you're traveling somewhere else and they'll ask, why didn't you stay with us longer? So I think that's definitely an aspect of travel. And I don't mind going back to Colombia, but sometimes my wife would say, oh, why don't we go to Japan or to Malaysia or somewhere closer in Asia? Because, she loves travel as well. And she often, going home for her isn't necessarily a kind of fun, exciting trip. It's great to catch up with family and friends, but it's not that same kind of adventure that she would like, I think. So, yeah, it's a tricky situation, I think, to deal with. But also, yeah, you do feel a bit guilty that you have to travel there and see people, and that maybe takes out from other trips that you would otherwise take.
Yes, exactly. And it's something we always think about too. It's like, yes, we want to go to Japan or we want to go somewhere else, but we need to go back and see family. And yet also that makes it, I feel like this is the way we're going to stop racism in the world, is by everyone intermarrying.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, actually, one thing with that is to get to Colombia from Australia, you have to go through Chile, Argentina, or you go through the US, through Los Angeles, San Francisco. So we try to kind of maybe stop off at some of those places along the way, and that, gets a bit of the travel in as well as catching up with family and friends.
Right. So this is the books and travel show. So apart from your own book, what are some books about or set in Colombia that you recommend?
So there's a few books that I recommend. One is called Oblivion by Hector Abad. In Spanish, it's called El Olvido que Seremos. And it's a memoir written by Hector Abad, who's a journalist. And it's about his father, who was a doctor in Medellin during the 80s. And he was actually killed by paramilitaries. And so it's a very heartbreaking, moving story about his father who tried to make the world a better place, or make Colombia a better place, but was eventually killed for, his kind of social work as a doctor. And it's been made into a Netflix series, which is out, I think, but I'm not sure if it's in all the Netflix all around the world. So that's a very good book, I think, to read, and probably check out the series as well, which I haven't seen yet. The second one is called One River, Explorations and Discoveries in the Amazon Rainforest by Wade Davis, who's a Canadian anthropologist and ethnobotanist, and has done a lot of work in Colombia identifying plants in the Amazon. And his mentor, his professor, was Richard Evans Schultz, who spent a long time in the Amazon. And so in the book, it's like a dual narrative or a dual biography of what his mentor, Richard Evans Schultz, has done, and then what he's now doing in Colombia. And they looked at, hallucinogenics and medicinal uses of plants. So it's a good way to get in touch with the, indigenous side of Colombia. Another one is a fiction novel by a Colombian author called Juan Gabriel Vázquez, but there's an English translation. The novel is called The Sound of Things Falling, and it's a kind of a noir novel about the Colombian drug trade in the 90s. And it involves a law lecturer who's looking into the seedier side of Bogota and is investigating a friend's murder. And it shows, his family and the connection to that murder, and how the early 90s and late 80s of Colombia really affected a lot of people in the country. And probably the last one I would say is another kind of non-fiction book called My Colombian War, A Journey Through the Country I Left Behind by Silvana Paternostro. And that's, again, a memoir about her as a journalist leaving Colombia to study in the US. And she went through all of the wars in the 80s in Central America, and then later came back to Colombia and looked at Colombia having lived outside the country, but also as being from the country, and looking at that period of the late 80s, early 90s, where there was a lot of conflict. So they're probably the four I'd recommend. And also, if I can throw in a cheeky podcast, the Colombian Calling podcast is also a very good podcast I listen to for all things Colombia. It's run by Richard McCall, who's a journalist and writer in Colombia, and he interviews a whole range of people that have to do something with Colombia. So I'd also recommend that.
Brilliant. So where can people find you and your book and everything you do online?
Well, I've got a website, so LachlanPageAuthor.com is the best way to go directly there. And my book's called Magical Disinformation. So if you type Magical Disinformation into Google, it should pop up with all the places you can find it, all the bookstores and online bookstores where it's available.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for your time, Lachlan. That was great.
Thanks, Joe. Pleasure.
Thanks for joining me today on the Books and Travel podcast. I hope you found a moment of escape. You can find the episode show notes at booksandtravel.page. And if you enjoy thrillers set in international locations, download one of my books for free at jfpen.com/free. Happy travels until next time.